On a Friday morning in April of 1979, in the county extension office in Butler County, Iowa, a soil map hung on the wall behind the agent's desk the way it had hung there for 15 years, color-coded, precise, and in the opinion of most farmers who looked at it, completely settled. The dark patches were the good ground, rich black prairie loam sitting 5, 6, 7 feet deep in places, the kind of soil that had made Iowa the center of American agriculture for 100 years. The gray patches were average, workable, productive, with proper management, the backbone of most family operations in the county, and then there was a section in the southwest corner of the map, near the bend where Beaver Creek turned north toward the Cedar River, shaded in a color that was almost white. 43 acres, Class 7 soil, rocky in the low spots, hard pan clay on the slopes, pH so alkaline from the underlying limestone that most commercial crops struggled to establish a root system before giving up entirely. The extension agent, a man named Phil Dorsey, had a name for that section. He called it the graveyard. Not on any official document, not in any report he filed with Iowa State, but at the counter when farmers asked about it. Phil had been the Butler County extension agent for 11 years, and in that time he had seen 3 different farmers attempt to work those 43 acres, and 3 different farmers walk away with less money than they had started with, and a deeper appreciation for why certain ground had never been farmed in the first place. The last man to try had been a tenant named Sorensen, who gave up after 2 seasons, told the absentee landowner in Des Moines that the ground was not farmable at any price that made economic sense, and moved his operation to better ground in Bremer County. The Des Moines landowner, a lawyer named Hartwick, who had inherited the parcel from an uncle and had never set foot on it, was quietly relieved to stop paying property taxes on ground that generated nothing and listed it for sale at $180 an acre in the spring of 1979. At a time when decent Butler County ground was selling for $2,800 an acre, $180 was the price of an apology. Nobody bought it for 3 months. Then, on a Thursday afternoon in late June, a man named Leonard Schoof drove out to look at it. Leonard was 52 years old and had farmed 180 acres on the north side of the county since 1958, when he bought his first ground with money saved from 7 years of hired farm work and a small inheritance from his mother's estate. He was not a wealthy man, and had never been a wealthy man, and had made his peace with that fact somewhere in his late 30s, arriving at a quiet certainty that wealth was not the point of what he was doing. The point was the land. The point was understanding it, working it, making it produce something it could not produce without him, and doing that honestly and without shortcuts. His 180 acres were good ground, well maintained, and carried no debt. Leonard had paid off his farm mortgage in 1971 and had not borrowed against the land since. When the expansion fever of the mid-1970s swept through Butler County and his neighbors were leveraging everything they had to buy more acres at inflated prices, Leonard had watched and kept his checkbook in his pocket. He was not afraid of the prices. He was not pessimistic about agriculture. He simply did not believe that borrowing heavily to buy ground at its peak was how a man built something that would last. What he believed in, and had believed in since his father taught him in the fields outside of Allison when Leonard was 12 years old, was soil. Not land as a financial asset, not acres as a unit of production, but soil as a living system that could be destroyed by mismanagement and built by patience in equal measure. His father had taken ground that was tired from 30 years of continuous corn and turned it, over a decade of careful rotation and organic matter additions, into some of the most productive soil in his township. Leonard had watched that transformation as a boy and had never forgotten the lesson it contained. He drove out to the graveyard on a Thursday afternoon and spent 4 hours walking it. He took soil samples from 31 different points. He noted where the hardpan clay began, where the limestone was close to the surface, where water pooled after rain, where the ground was droughty, and where it was wet. He looked at the existing vegetation, the weeds and the volunteer plants that grew on ground nobody was managing, and read them the way his father had taught him to read them, as indicators of what the soil lacked and what it might support if handled correctly. He came home that evening and sat at the kitchen table with his notes and a pad of graph paper and worked through what he had found until 10 o'clock at night. His wife Helen brought him coffee twice and did not ask questions, because she had been married to Leonard for 28 years and knew what it meant when he sat at the kitchen table with graph paper after looking at a piece of ground. The following Monday, he called Hartwick's office in Des Moines and made an offer. He offered $95 an acre for the 43 acres, cash, no contingencies, closing in 30 days. Hartwick accepted before the end of the phone call. Leonard paid $4,085 for 43 acres of the worst soil in Butler County on a Tuesday in July of 1979. Now let me tell you about the man himself before we go any further, because you need to understand who Leonard Schoof was before you can understand what he was about to do, and why everyone around him was so certain he was wrong. Leonard had learned farming from his father, August, who had learned it from his father before him. 3 generations of men who understood one thing above everything else: that soil was not a surface you planted on. It was a system you either fed or starved. Every farm in Butler County was starving its soil slightly, year after year, taking more than it put back, treating the ground as a warehouse rather than a living thing. Leonard had watched this his entire life and had done things differently on his own 180 acres, quietly, without announcing it, in the way that men do things when they are more interested in results than recognition. He was the kind of man who read seed catalogs in January not for the pictures, but for the germination data, who kept a notebook of every soil sample he had ever taken, organized by field and by year, so he could see the trends that a single sample could never show, who drove his tractor at the pace the work required and not faster, because he understood that speed in the field was usually borrowed from somewhere else in the system. Quiet, patient, thorough. The kind of man that county fairs do not give trophies to, but that county histories, if they are honest, cannot be written without. If you have made it this far into this story, if something in Leonard's patience and his willingness to see what others could not see has spoken to something in you, take a moment right now and hit subscribe. May good things find you wherever you are watching from, and may God walk beside you through every hard season and every hopeful spring of your life. Now let me tell you what the county said when it found out what Leonard had bought, because that is where the real tension in this story begins. The co-op in Allison was where information moved in Butler County in 1979, and within a week of the sale closing, the information had moved completely. Leonard Schoof had bought the graveyard, the 43 acres of hardpan limestone clay that 3 farmers had already failed on, bought for $95 an acre by a man who apparently believed he could do something with it. The reaction was not unkind exactly. It was the reaction of knowledgeable people responding to information that simply did not make sense to them. Phil Dorsey shook his head. He had nothing against Leonard. He considered him one of the more capable farmers in his territory. But he had the soil data on those 43 acres, and the soil data did not support optimism. The man who had the strongest reaction was named Robert Caskey. Robert was 48 years old, farmed 800 acres in the western part of the county, and was in the middle of the most aggressive expansion phase of his career. having added 320 acres to his operation in the previous 2 years at prices that made Leonard's $95 purchase look like a rounding error. Robert was a loud man and a confident man, and a man who had been right often enough about enough things that he had developed a certainty about his own judgment that extended further than his judgment actually reached. Robert heard about the sale at the co-op counter on a Wednesday morning and laughed in the specific way that men laugh when they hear something that confirms what they already believed about another man's limitations. "Schoof bought the graveyard," he announced to the 3 men standing with him. "$95 an acre, for ground that Sorensen couldn't grow weeds on." He shook his head with theatrical wonder. "Leonard's a decent farmer on decent ground. But that ground isn't decent, that ground is dead. Has been dead since before any of us were born." One of the men at the counter, a younger farmer named Dave Herr, said carefully that maybe Leonard had a plan for it. Robert looked at him with the patience of a man explaining something obvious. "What plan? You can't lime your way out of hard-pan clay. You can't fertilize your way through limestone at 8 inches. The ground is what it is, and what it is worthless." He paused, looking around at the men at the counter. "I'll tell you what. I'll bet any man here $10,000 that in 5 years that ground is still producing nothing. 5 years from now, Schoof either walks away from it or it costs him more than it earns. $10,000. I'll take that bet from anyone in this room." Nobody took the bet in the room, but the words traveled through the county the way words travel through small communities, completely and quickly. And within 2 weeks, Leonard had heard the exact terms of Robert Caskey's $10,000 offer, reported to him by his neighbor Art Fennell, who felt Leonard ought to know. Leonard listened to Art's account without expression. Then he went back to what he had been doing, which was loading manure onto a spreader for the first application to the graveyard's lower section. "Are you going to say anything to him?" Art asked. Leonard looked at the spreader. "Not yet," he said. "Now let me tell you what Leonard did to those 43 acres over the next 5 years, because it is the heart of this story, and it deserves to be told carefully. The first thing Leonard did was nothing that anyone would have recognized as farming. He did not plow. He did not plant a cash crop. He did not apply commercial fertilizer on ground that commercial fertilizer could not help until the underlying soil chemistry had been addressed. He spent the entire first season doing 3 things that looked, from the road, like a man wasting his time on ground that was not worth his time. He limed it, not at the standard rate, but at 3 times the standard rate, working it in with a disc in the fall of 1979 and again in the spring of 1980, targeting the most alkaline sections first, where the pH was running above 8.0 and nothing useful would establish. He used a specific calcitic lime product to address a calcium-magnesium imbalance, not standard agricultural lime, and the distinction mattered in ways that took time to reveal themselves. He seeded it with a cover crop mix that no seed dealer in Butler County had in stock, a combination of hairy vetch, crimson clover, and tillage radish ordered from a specialist supplier in Illinois. Not a cash crop, a biological intervention. The tillage radish in particular was doing something no mechanical implement could do as cheaply. Its tap roots growing 2 and 3 feet into the hard pan clay, fracturing the compacted layers that had made the ground impenetrable for decades, creating channels for water and air and root systems to follow. He spread manure, 15 loads in the fall of 1980, another 12 in the spring of 1981, hauled from a hog operation 4 miles away, whose owner was glad to have someone take it. Not a fertilizer application in the conventional sense, a biological inoculant, introducing microbial life into ground that had been biologically dead for so long that the basic infrastructure of productive soil had to be rebuilt from effectively zero. Robert Caskey drove past the graveyard in the spring of 1981, saw the cover crop growth and the manure applications and the absence of any cash crop, and stopped his truck to look. At the co-op that afternoon, he said that Schoof was apparently composting 43 acres of worthless ground, and that the 5-year deadline on his $10,000 offer was looking better every month. The people at the counter laughed. Phil Dorsey, who happened to be there, did not laugh. He had driven past the graveyard that same week and noticed something in the cover crop stand he had not expected, a density and vigor in the crimson clover that suggested the soil biology was responding faster than his experience with that ground would have predicted. He said nothing at the counter, but he drove back out on Saturday morning and walked a section of it, and what he found made him go back to his office and pull out Leonard's soil sample file and look at the numbers again with different eyes. In the spring of 1982, Leonard planted oats on the 12 flattest, best-recovering acres. Not corn, not soybeans. Oats, which tolerated higher pH and lower organic matter than the major cash crops, used as a nurse crop to establish a permanent clover stand beneath them. No commercial fertilizer, no herbicide. The oats came up thin in places, and Robert Caskey, driving past in May, told people at the elevator that Schoof's Miracle Ground was producing the worst-looking oats in the county. By July, the oats were respectable. The yield that August was 54 bushels per acre, below the county average on good ground, but produced at a cost per bushel that was lower than anything being grown on prime ground in the county because Leonard had purchased essentially nothing to grow them. More importantly, beneath the oats, the clover stand was thick and healthy and already doing the long-term work. The organic matter in those 12 acres, which had tested at 0.8% in 1979, was at 1.4% by the fall of 1982. It does not sound like much. It was enormous. It meant the biology had taken hold. It meant the soil was alive in a way it had not been alive in living memory. Phil Dorsey came out in October of 1982 and took his own samples. He looked at the numbers in his office for a long time. Then he called a colleague at Iowa State. The colleague asked him to send the data. 3 days later, the colleague called back and said he would like to come out and see the ground himself. He came in November. A soil scientist named Dr. Werner from the agronomy department, and spent a full day on the 43 acres. At the end of the day, he stood at the field edge with Phil Dorsey and said that what Schoof was doing was not farming in any conventional sense. It was soil reconstruction, and it was working faster than the literature suggested it should. Leonard, when Phil told him, said that was fine as long as nobody got in the way of the work. Now let me tell you about the spring of 1984. Because 5 years had passed from Robert Caskey's $10,000 challenge, and the clock had run out in a way that Robert had not been paying sufficient attention to. Leonard planted corn on 22 of the 43 acres that spring. The best recovered ground, where the pH had come down to workable levels and the organic matter had built to the point where a cash crop could be supported. He used a modest starter fertilizer, the minimum necessary for ground that was still building rather than fully built. He interseeded a cover crop at planting to continue the biological work through the growing season. The corn came up even and strong in a way that no corn had come up on that ground in anyone's memory. By July, it was standing 9 feet, and the leaves were not rolling in the afternoon heat the way corn rolled on tight clay ground nearby, because the soil was holding moisture the way soil with genuine organic matter holds moisture, like a sponge, releasing slowly, keeping the root zone supplied through the dry periods that stressed every conventional field around it. Robert Caskey drove past in late July and did not stop. He had been driving past periodically for 5 years, and each time the ground had looked a little better than before, and the feeling this produced in him was one he did not examine closely, because examining it would have required acknowledging something he had said publicly in front of witnesses. The corn yielded 127 bushels per acre in the fall of 1984. The Butler County average that year on Class 1 soil, the best ground in the county, was 119 bushels per acre. Leonard Schoof's 43 acres of the graveyard, the ground that 3 farmers had failed on, the ground that Robert Caskey had publicly offered $10,000 against, had just outperformed the best soil in Butler County. Phil Dorsey put the yield numbers in a report he sent to Iowa State with Dr. Werner's documentation. The report was titled, "Biological Soil Restoration in Northeast Iowa, a 5-year case study." It would be cited in academic literature for the next decade. At the elevator in Allison on the day Leonard brought his first load of corn from the graveyard, word moved through the county with the speed that genuinely surprising information always moves. The yield numbers were on the scale tickets. They were not rumor. They were recorded fact. Robert Caskey heard about it on a Thursday evening. He sat with the information for a day and a half. Then, on a Saturday morning, he drove to Leonard's farm. Leonard was in the machine shed cleaning the combine head when Robert's truck came up the lane. He looked up and waited. Robert got out and stood in the shed doorway. He was a large man, and he filled the doorway, and for a moment he said nothing. He looked at the combine, at the organized shed, at Leonard standing with a cleaning brush in his hand. 127 bushels, Robert said. 127, Leonard confirmed. Robert was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the October wind moved through the cottonwoods along the fence line with the dry, rattling sound of a season ending. "I said $10,000 that ground would fail," Robert said. "In 5 years." "You did." "It didn't fail." "No." Robert looked at his boots, then up at Leonard. "I don't have $10,000 sitting loose right now," he said. And there was something in the way he said it that was not evasion, but was closer to honesty than Robert Caskey had managed in a long time. The farm crisis had reached Butler County in 1984 with the same force it had reached every other county in Iowa. And Robert's heavily leveraged operation was in the early stages of a financial difficulty that would become a full crisis by 1986. "I'll pay what I said I'd pay. It'll take me some time." Leonard looked at him for a moment. Then he set down the cleaning brush and walked to the shed doorway and stood beside Robert, both men looking out at the harvested fields in the October light. "Keep your money," Leonard said. Robert looked at him. "I made the bet." "I know. Keep it anyway. You're going to need it more than I will. The ground already paid me." Robert was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was different from the voice he had used at the co-op counter in 1979. "How did you know it would work?" he asked. 5 years ago when you bought that ground. How did you know?" Leonard thought about it carefully. "I didn't know," he said. "I knew what the soil needed, and I knew how to give it what it needed. And I knew that soil biology responds to good management if you give it enough time. But I didn't know it would work the way it worked. I hoped it would." He paused. "The difference between me and the men who failed on that ground wasn't that I knew more. It was that I was willing to wait longer. They wanted a cash crop in year 1. The ground wasn't ready for a cash crop in year 1. I was willing to spend year 1 giving the ground what it needed, instead of asking the ground for what I needed." He looked at Robert. "That's the whole thing. That's all it was." Robert nodded. He stayed another 20 minutes. When he left, he drove home more quietly than he had driven anywhere in some time. Leonard Schoof farmed his 180 acres and his 43 recovered acres through the entire farm crisis without losing a single field. In 1986, When Butler County land values hit their lowest point and neighboring parcels were selling for $600 an acre, Phil Dorsey had the recovered 43 acres appraised for an extension service report. The appraiser came back with a number that Dorsey read twice before accepting it: $1,420 an acre. The ground purchased for $95 in 1979, the ground Robert Caskey had offered $10,000 against, was now appraised in the worst land market Iowa had seen since the Great Depression, at 15 times its purchase price. The highest per acre appraisal in that section of Butler County, higher than the Class 1 ground, higher than the well-drained upland that had been producing maximum yields for a century. Phil Dorsey framed that appraisal report and hung it on the wall of his office next to the soil map with the white patch in the southwest corner. He left it there until he retired in 1993. On his last day, he took the soil map down and looked at the white patch for a long time. Then he colored it in, not gray, not the medium shade of good ground, but the darkest shade on the map, the color he used for the best ground in the county. He wrote 3 words in the margin next to it: Schoof was right. Leonard Schoof farmed until 2001. He sold his 180 acres to a neighboring family who had been looking for ground of that quality for years. The 43 acres he gave to his son Carl, who had been farming alongside him for 15 years and who understood the soil the way Leonard understood it, completely, and with a patience that matched his father's. Carl Schoof farms those 43 acres today. The organic matter is above 5%, equal to virgin prairie soil that has never been broken. The yield history over the past 20 years runs consistently above the county average on any crop he plants. The ground that was worth $95 an acre in 1979 carries a value today that Leonard, sitting at his kitchen table with his graph paper in June of that year, would have considered beyond reasonable expectation. But Leonard would not have been surprised by the soil. He would have expected the soil, because he understood something about patience and biology and the long work of building something real that the men at the Allison Co-op counter in 1979 had not yet learned. The lesson this story leaves behind is simple, and it is hard. Value that lasts is almost never built quickly. The ground that becomes the most productive is rarely the ground that was always productive. It is the ground that someone was willing to work on before it showed any sign of returning the investment. Robert Caskey bet $10,000 against Leonard Schoof because he could not see past the surface of the soil to what was possible beneath it. He was looking at what the ground was. Leonard was looking at what the ground could become with enough time, enough patience, and enough understanding of what it actually needed. The same principle applies to everything worth building: the farm, the business, the family, the life. You do not see the result in year 1. You do not see it in year 2. You see it when you have given something what it needs consistently and patiently for long enough that it has no choice but to respond. Leonard Schoof gave 43 acres of dead ground 5 years of honest, careful, patient work. The ground gave him back something that outlasted every other farm in the county through the worst agricultural crisis in 50 years. Patience is not waiting. Patience is working without being able to see the result yet, and trusting that the result is coming because the work is right. That is the lesson. It was written in the soil of Butler County, Iowa, in numbers that an appraiser documented and a soil scientist published and an extension agent framed on his wall. Some lessons do not need to be said. They just need to be lived long enough for everyone watching to understand them. If this story stayed with you, if it reminded you that the most valuable things are almost always the ones that take the longest to build, leave the word soil in the comments. Just that one word. And if you want more stories from the farms and the fields and the people who understood that patience is the most powerful tool any of them ever picked up, subscribe. These stories are worth keeping, and there are more of them coming.